Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series where we bring Precon decks up to cut rate standards without breaking the bank. As usual, this is your host Grazzet, and today we'll be tackling the Final Fantasy Precon with the hardest to pronounce card names by volume, that being the Final Fantasy XIV Scions and Spellcraft Precon, led by the Scion representative of Limsa Lominsa, Y'shtola Knights Blessed, to which we'll be adding $30 worth of upgrades to give it a budget but considerable power up. But before we continue, please do consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you enjoy this content. And if you really like it, also consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee to help keep me caffeinated, or through my Game Nerds affiliate link to net me those sweet kickbacks through any purchases made through them to help fuel my caffeine addiction that way, both in the description below. Now, with all that shilling out of the way, let's kick off this upgrade guide by taking a deeper look at its commander and the base deck itself. Y'shtola Knights Blessed is a 2/4 cat warlock that costs 1 an Esper, has built-in vigilance, and the following 2 abilities. Firstly, at the beginning of each end step, if a player lost 4 more life this turn, we draw a card. And secondly, whenever we cast a non-creature spell of mana value 3 or greater, Y'shtola deals 2 damage to each opponent and we gain 2 life. Taking a closer look at the strengths that our commander brings to the table, the first and foremost is Y'shtola's ability to passively generate card advantage for us by simply existing, as her first ability only cares about damage being dealt and not who deals it, allowing her to simply sit on the board generating as continual value whether it's us or our opponents that are the ones that are losing life. That said, her second ability is also quite impressive, not only allowing us to drain the table every time we cast mid to high cost non-creature spells to help keep us alive for longer while whittling down our opponents, but also having Y'shtola be the one that inflicts the damage, which opens up potential synergies with damage-dependent keywords and abilities that can proc every single time she deals damage. As usual though, it's not all good news, as if and when our opponents realize that our commander's generating us constant value while they're dealing damage to each other, they'll undoubtedly try to remove her to deny us resources. And on top of that, the cost restriction on our AoE drain will inevitably increase the mana curve of any deck she helms, potentially slowing down that deck and or leaving us starved for mana to cast our high CMC spells if we're not careful, meaning that we'll need to have both ways to disrupt our opponent's removal attempts and not go too overboard with the high CMC spells, or at least have enough ramp to support it, if we want to maximize our commander's potential. Then as we look at the base deck itself, we'll see that it does attempt to enable our commander as much as possible, containing 31 CMC 3+ non-creature spells to proc her second ability fairly reliably, 17 non-creature spell payoffs to generate value alongside her, and 15 sources of ramp to help offset its somewhat high base mana curve, which between them and our commander's very easy to proc draw should make the deck playable out of the box. Playable, however, is the operative word here, as while it does have the CMC 3+ non-creature spells required to enable our commander, those spells are quite frankly all over the place when it comes to their effects, with some being pillow fort pieces aimed at slowing down our opponents, others focusing on creating creature tokens to build up our board, and others still being random +1/+1 counter generation and a dragon tribal support, just to name a few, making the final build feel very disjointed and ultimately lacking in anything remotely considered a cohesive game plan outside of simply proccing our commander's drain reliably, which is fine, but far from great. So, in order for us to elevate this deck into something more unified, the first thing we'll need to do is commit ourselves to one of the deck's multitude of potential archetypes, and, seeing as this deck's name is Scions Spellcraft, I opted to commit further into the spellslinger/control aspects of the build, as Y'shtola can greatly benefit from us being able to cast at flash speed to both keep her alive, proc her drain, and draw us multiple cards per rotation. As such, we'll be cutting a good portion of the other disjointed archetypes present in the base build to make space for additional instance, primarily in the form of quote-unquote free spells, those that we can cast at a discount, or those that give us 2 spells for the price of 1, so we can cast more spells per rotation to proc Y'shtola and our other spellslinger payoffs, along with more removal and disruption to keep our opponents from gaining a foothold while we drain the life from them, and additional spellslinger payoffs to generate us even more value as we sling those spells. Then coupling that with even more life loss inflicting effects to burn out our opponents even faster while generating us more value, we'll be left with a much more focused build that will easily be able to control the table while sucking the life out of our opponents. So let us dive into the world of Final Fantasy XIV and travel to the marine city-state of Limsa Lominsa, which is where we'll find our commander Y'shtola Rule, one of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn and friend and ally to the Warrior of Light, guiding their journey from its start in A Realm Reborn and up to now in Dawn Trail, growing alongside the protagonist from a conjurer specialized in healing to a mighty arcane-wielding black mage upon joining the Knights Blessed when hurled through time and space alongside them. And no matter how many more adventures, or rather expansions, await them, they'll continue to lend them their support, if only to keep the player count high with her appearances. So, now that we have a better understanding of the commander and the base deck, let's see what we can do to improve it. We'll first begin our upgrades by augmenting this build's ability to inflict life loss, whether it be to ourselves or our opponents, which Y'shtola and a number of both creature and non-creature sources already in the deck can already do semi-regularly, but we'll be building upon to proc Y'shtola's draw more reliably and to end games faster. So, starting with some new additions specifically meant to cause life loss to our opponents, we'll be scrapping Blue Mage's Cane, whose on-attack enemy spell theft effect is both too dependent on the content of our opponent's graveyards and our own ability to reliably attack in to get the maximum usage out of it, especially when considering we still need to pay 3 to cast that spell, to make space for Talion the Kindly Lord, who, if we declare 2 or 3, can simply sit and play, whittling away at our opponent's life totals as they cast spells with that matching mana value, power, and or toughness, while generating us card advantage with his own ability and occasionally swinging in with his evasive body to get us over Y'shtola's damage threshold on our turn to proc her draw, and swapping out the legend Ardbert Warrior of Darkness, whose legendary focused +1/+1 counter distribution would be better suited in a dedicated historic build rather than the Spellslinger direction we took this deck in, so we can swap in Kambal, Consul of Allocation, whose drain effect every time our opponents cast non-creature spells not only further pads our life totals alongside Y'shtola, but who also lets us combine our spells with our opponents to proc Y'shtola's draw more often with their combined damage, which can be particularly effective when we're countering their non-creature spells. And while on the topic of counter spells, we'll also be cutting Hypnotic Sprite, whose adventure counter spell is a bit too limited on targets to warrant running it, along with Crux of Fate, which is not worth running over our other wipes since it's almost always a vanilla wipe due to us only having a single dragon in our 99, in favor of Undermine and Deny the Witch, both of which give us additional disruption by countering any spell our opponents can throw our way while generally inflicting enough damage to proc our commander's draw when we do so, with the latter even expanding its disruption to include activated and triggered abilities for even better coverage. Then, to wrap up our enemy-only life drain additions, we'll be replacing Champions from Beyond, which is spectacular in a go-wide build thanks to the repeatable draw and AoE stat boost it can provide, but much less impressive here due to our low creature count and poor token creation, with Suspended Sentence, which is admittedly a bit pricey for creature removal, but makes up for it by inflicting 5 damage between its own and our commander's life loss to reliably proc her draw, and keeps coming back every 3 turns off of Suspend to keep removing threats and inflicting that damage at no additional mana cost for additional disruption damage and value. Then pivoting away from enemy life loss sources and onto self life loss sources, which our commander can help take the edge off via her healing while they still help proc her draw. We'll briefly stay on the targeted removal game plan by shelving Hildebrand Manderville's repeatable token creation and stat boosting, which would be a much better fit in a dedicated token build, along with Coveted Jewel, which costs way too much for a card that we can easily lose to an opponent and then have them generate ramp and draw off of, to make room for Dismember and Anguished Unmaking, both of which are excellent sources of instant speed non-destruction removal, whose self-damage changes from a liability to a benefit alongside our commander, with the former always giving us the option to deal 4 damage to ourselves to reduce its cost to 1, enabling us to always draw off of it if we want to, and the latter, while it hits us for only 3, generally is enough for us to trigger her draw off of any damage we take below the damage threshold before or after we cast it. And we'll then close out our self-damage dealing sources by switching out the 2 symmetrical draw spell Cut a Deal for the AoE life loss inflicting draw spell Risky Shortcut, which is functionally a draw 3 alongside Y'shtola, who also negates the damage it would inflict on us through her healing while hurting our opponents even more. and removing Thancred Waters from the party, whose legendary protection can be useful at keeping our commander or plethora of other legendary creatures alive, but I find to be a bit too expensive to be worth running here, so we can add in Staff of Completion, which lets us convert our life into additional ramp and draw so we can more reliably get to and cast our spells, and since its draw cost is exactly 4 life, it's functionally a draw 2 alongside Y'shtola for even more card advantage. And then as one final life loss entry that can cause life loss to both us and our opponents, we'll be unsummoning Good King Mog XII, which needs more high quality tokens to reach its full potential than we can provide, so we can make space for Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, who's doing her best budget impression of Sheoldred the Apocalypse, though admittedly a lot less accurately since she inflicts damage to anyone that casts spells rather than just harming our opponents and healing us. Still, she's about $70 cheaper, can heal us back with her built-in lifelink, and can reliably proc our commander's draw on our turn thanks to her massive evasive stat block, making her an acceptable substitute in my opinion. Now, having covered all the changes we made aimed at inflicting life loss to the table, let's move on to some new Spellslinger additions more geared towards letting us cast more spells in general so that we can proc Y'shtola's life drain and draw more reliably that way. Seeing as, unless damage is being inflicted in some other way, we'll be needing to cast at least 2 spells per turn in order to deal enough damage ourselves to proc Y'shtola's draw, it only makes sense for us to include some spells that let us either cheat on their cost, or at least net us 2 spells for the price of 1, of which the base deck admittedly has a handful of entries already, but we'll be beefing up considerably to let us sling our spells even more often. So starting off with some spells that are technically free by virtue of letting us untap lands equal to their mana cost, we'll be smelting down Reaper's Scythe, which yes, can provide one of our creatures with a massive stat boost due to Y'shtola's repeatable AoE life drain, but seeing as we don't have that many creatures that can get in for damage reliably to use that stat boost, we'll instead be giving its spot to Frantic Search, which provides us with some quote-unquote manaless instant speed card selection so that we may dig for more spells and Spellslinger payoffs, as well as letting go of the surprisingly narrow Krill Baldessian, whose creature recursion based on exact mana value is a bit too limited for us, and a much too slow Orianger Agurelt, who can take up to 3 turns to let us cast a spell off of his effect, and really needs reliable ways to untap him so he can really shine, in order to make room for Unwind and Rewind, both of which further contribute to our spell disruption suite and let us keep our mana open for either more disruption on subsequent turns or for a follow-up spell after them if we want the draw. Then as a CMC3 plus spell that we can cast for significantly less, we'll be retiring Torrential Gearhulk, whose ability to reuse an instant from our bin is certainly useful, but its high mana cost and our inability to get repeated uses out of it really holding it back in this build, so we'll be replacing it with Baleful Mastery, which we can cast for 2 at the low cost of letting any opponent draw a card, not just the one whose creature or planeswalker we're exiling, making it a cheap, non-destruction piece of removal that still procs our commander with relatively little downside. And as we reach the end of this category, we'll be closing it out by scrapping Astrologian's Planisphere, whose non-creature spell-based +1/+1 counter generation is a bit too weak of a payoff when we won't be doing a whole lot of attacking, as well as shelving Sublime Epiphany, whose massive mana cost makes it a bit too awkward to use here when we usually want to be casting at least 2 spells per turn, so we can add in the 2-for-1 spells, Press the Enemy, and Counterpoint, both of which let us cast a second spell at no mana cost as we cast them, the first being a pseudo-remand for spells on the stack or a bounce spell for permanents in play for flexible disruption, and letting us cast an extra instant or sorcery from our hand, while the second is a pure counter spell that instead lets us cast a creature instant sorcery or planeswalker spell from our bin when it resolves, making them both excellent at proccing our commander's drain twice all on their own. Now, having covered all the spells that we've added to the build designed to get more procs off of our commander, let's move on to all the other new non-creature spells that we've added to the build meant to add more disruption, value, and utility. As mentioned previously, while the base deck does have a decent number of CMC3 plus spells already to proc our commander with, we'll be aiming to increase both the quantity and quality of those spells for added consistency and power, particularly when it comes to maintaining control of the board and getting extra mileage out of our commander. For example, on the interaction side of things, we'll begin by unequipping Sage's Newliths, whose low CMC and on-attack creature untapping really doesn't enable this build in any significant way, so we can slot in Disallow, which gives us the option to counter spells and abilities for added coverage that your standard counterspell would be unable to provide, as well as raising the Badland Temple of the False God and exercising the lackluster token creator Lingering Souls to make room for the spot removal spells Stroke of Midnight and Generous Gift, both of which provide phenomenal coverage by dealing with almost any type of permanent threat our opponents could try and drop on us. And then as one final piece of interaction, we'll be terraforming the Fixing Land Ash Barrens into the MDFC Hagara Mauling, which we can still play as a land if we need to make our land drops in the early game, but is much better to draw into in the late game as an extra removal spell rather than just an extra land drop. Then switching gears from removing our opponent's threats and onto generating more resources for ourselves, we'll be putting Tome of Legends and Into the Story back on the shelf, the former's at best one draw per rotation not being too impressive in this build since we have access to better options, while the latter's potential draw 3 for 4 is a lot better, but still pales in comparison to its replacements, Curiosity and Helm of the Ghast Lord, both of which can draw us up to 3 cards every single time our commander's AoE procs since she's the one inflicting the damage, the former doing so at a dirt cheap cost that can easily be followed up by another spell to begin generating card advantage immediately, and the latter, while slower, makes up for its increased cost by also tacking on AoE discard, enabling us to tear apart our opponent's hands while we replenish our own. And then to improve our core stats even further by beefing up our mana sources, we'll be putting Dancer's Chakrams back in storage, whose lifelink granting to our commander can be useful to further pad our life totals, but in practice is rarely needed since we're constantly proccing her AoE life drain anyway, and unlearning the clone spell Rite of Replication, which is not all that useful to us since 14 of our 18 creatures are legendary, so we can add in the Mana Rocks, Felwar Stone and Decanter of Endless Water in their place, both of which provide us with more access to colored mana so that we can cast our spells faster and more reliably, with the first coming down faster to help set up our board in the early game despite not proccing our commander, and the second being able to proc Y'shtola and removing our maximum hand size limit, which we'll certainly need if we have any on-damage draw on our commander flooding our hands with cards every time she procs. And at last, as our final pair of non-creature spell additions that don't quite fit into our other categories but are still useful, we'll be getting rid of Bastion of Remembrance, which lacks the disposable bodies and sack outlets needed to reliably proc its AoE life drain in this build, so we can add in Ghostly Prison, which works nicely alongside the propaganda already in the deck to make attacking into us even harder for our opponents, and removing one of the deck's basic planes so we can add another MDFC in the form of Waterlogged Teachings, which again gives us the option to play it as a land drop early, but also functions as an instant tutor in the later game that procs our commander for added consistency. So having finally reached the end of all the new non-creature spells we've added to the build to better enable our commander, let's wrap up this upgrade guide by going over a few new creature additions aimed at generating value alongside her. While this build certainly isn't lacking in the creature department, containing a decent selection of creatures that play very well into our non-creature oriented game plan for additional support and value, we'll be using the last of our budget to remove the base deck's less synergistic ones to make space for creatures that either better support our non-creature spells or our commander. Starting with the former category, we'll be releasing the artifact bird Baleful Strix, which doesn't provide our build with much value outside of its ETB cantrip and evasive body, so we can replace it with the more on-theme bird Stormscape Familiar, which is still evasive but now reduces the cost of all our white and black spells by 1, which is invaluable in letting us build up our board faster while letting us keep mana open to interact with our opponents on their turn. And then as a more direct piece of non-creature support, we'll also be releasing the dragon Hesvelgar of the First Brood, whose non-creature based on blockability seems a bit redundant when he's already evasive, even if you do consider the temporary power boost he gets alongside it, so we can make space for Jingataxis, who functions as a much better non-creature spell payoff by turning all our CMC 3+ non-creature spells into cantrips with his front face, and, once we have a full grip, we can transform into the Great Synthesis, which generates us even more card advantage, wipes the board with with his Mass Bounce, and then allows us to cast our entire hand at no mana cost, often allowing Y'shtola to deal absurd amounts of AoE damage in one turn to help close out games. And then as our lone entrant in the latter category, we'll be removing Estenian Varanlu, who's a dragon support piece that's reduced to a draw 1 per rotation in this build since we don't have enough dragons to support him, to slot in Tandem Lookout in his place, which like our previous editions of Curiosity and Helm of the Ghast Lord, turns Y'shtola into a repeatable draw 3 every time we proc her for even more card advantage. So, now that we've covered all the upgrades that we've made to the deck, let's take a look at this build's final breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 38 CMC 3+ non-creature spells, including 4 quote-unquote free spells, 5 spells that we can cast at a reduced rate, and 2 spells that allow us to cast 2 spells for the price of 1, giving us plenty of ways to proc Y'shtola's AoE drain while not slowing ourselves too much while we do so, 10 cards that care about non-creature spells to generate us even more value from them alongside our commander while not going overboard, as well as 17 sources of life loss and 3 sources of on-damage draw, allowing us to further enable and take advantage of our commander's draw and AoE drain. For general deck stats, our final build has 17 ramp sources, 14 card draw sources, 26 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes, our ramp being higher than average in this build so that we can more easily cast our CMC 3+ spells back to back to proc our commander, while our targeted removal is through the roof since we'll be needing it to control the flow of the game in order to allow our commander and other life drain sources to finish off our opponents. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.30, which is actually faster than it may appear initially due to our selection of free and reduced cost spells, in which we'll be aiming to ramp hard in the early game to get our commander online, then pivot to a more reactionary playstyle, slowly building up our board with more life loss effects while keeping mana up for disruption to prevent our opponents from properly getting their own game plans off the ground or from interfering with ours, until they're eventually bled dry. The total price of all the upgrades we made here then totals out to be $30.50, which doesn't include taxes or shipping or the base price of the deck itself, which is currently an inflated $105 for the cheapest one I could find, well above its recommended $70 MSRP. So if you haven't pre-ordered it already, you may end up having to pay a premium for it unless it goes down in price later. Now, if we're looking to upgrade this deck even further, for an additional $5 budget increase, we can consider either cutting the versatile but slow removal spell Vindicate for the more on-theme life loss-inducing wipe Toxic Deluge, which can bypass destruction protection and we can scale to deal enough damage to us to proc Y'shtola if we can cast her after it resolves, or sideline the Scion to Tarutaru, whose treasure creation can be unreliable at times if our opponents don't have ways to draw cards outside of their turn, in favor of Lotho Corrupt Sheriff, who creates treasures much more easily as we and our opponents cast multiple spells per turn for much better mana stockpiling, while also contributing life loss for ourselves for the draw. Then, for a total $15 budget increase, we can also look into switching out Archmage Emeritus's instant and sorcery specific draw for either Stega River Cutthroat or Ophidian Eye, both of which cost less and whose damage based draw is easier for us to proc more consistently, or replacing more basics in our land slots for the MDFCs Fell the Profane and Sink into Stupor, which provide the build with even more disruption while not eating into our land drops in doing so, and, if we do play them as lands, give us the option to inflict damage onto ourselves to proc our draw if we need to. And then for a total $30 budget increase, alongside the previously mentioned changes, we can swap out Authority of the Console's tap down and life gain for the life-draining Bloodchief Ascension, which we can get online as soon as a single rotation, and then just repeatedly hurts our opponents while healing us as they cast their spells, lose their creatures, or send cards to their bin in any other fashion. Or, alternatively, we can scrap Staff of Completion's self-life drain for the arguably better self-life draining Black Market Connections, which can simultaneously ramp and draw us instead of us having to pick one per rotation, and its ramp being in the form of treasure so we can stockpile it for bigger turns later. And finally, for those of us with no limit to our budget due to our love of the game or financial irresponsibility, we can replace Disallow and Deny the Witch with the free spells Fierce Guardianship and Deadly Rollick for even more manaless interaction that procs our commander, swap out Tandem Lookout for the better commander enabling Delenny Streetwise Lookout, who doubles up on our commander's draw and drain to make her even deadlier, and, for those of us with the deepest pockets, we can evolve Leasa Shroud of Dusk to her non-budget version, Sholdred the Apocalypse, who only hurts our opponents while healing us, this time whenever cards are drawn to make avoiding that damage even harder. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, with the Scions and Spellcraft upgrade completed and archived, up next is the fourth and final of the Final Fantasy precons we'll be tackling, that being the Final Fantasy VI Revival Trance precon, along with its face commander, Terra Herald of Hope, so look forward to this small creature reanimator build coming soon. But before you go, as usual, please do like, comment, and subscribe to help keep the almighty algorithm appeased. Consider donating to my Buy Me a Coffee or buying products through my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to throw a few bucks my way so I can keep making this content, and be sure to check out all my other deck techs either floating around my head or on the playlist above if you want to see more content like this one. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.